Jim Lara, testing doctors for AIDS, the new CIA, and making hay in Kansas. Tonight on the McNeil-Lara NewsHour.
Good evening. Leading the news this Tuesday, President Bush said he's considering easing the embargo against Iraq. Israeli Prime Minister Shamir said he expects Mideast peace talks to begin within 2 months. We'll have details in our news summary in a moment. Jim?
After the news summary, we hear what doctors think of the move toward mandatory AIDS testing for them and other medical workers. Then Bruce Van Voorst of Time magazine reports on what a post-Cold War CIA should be and not be, and essayist Jim Fisher talks about making hay in Kansas.
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by AT&T. AT&T has supported the McNeil-Lara NewsHour since 1983 because quality information and quality communications is our idea of a good connection. AT&T. The right choice. And by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And by the financial support of viewers like you.
President Bush said today he's considering whether to allow Iraq to sell limited amounts of oil again so it can buy food and medicine. The Iraqi news agency quoted health ministry officials today as saying the world trade embargo endangered the lives of thousands of sick people, especially children, in Iraq's hospitals. President Bush spoke at a White House photo opportunity this morning.
My view is the UN mechanism is clear in terms of helping children and those who may be threatened with either famine or disease. Machinery's in place there. And it's very clear that Saddam Hussein has not complied with the UN resolution, so we'll see what we can do. We're not trying to hurt any individuals there. Our argument is not with the women and children of Iraq. It's with the dictator.
Later, White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater said the administration was concerned that Iraq might be diverting relief supplies for political purposes. 3 U.S. soldiers were killed today in an accidental explosion near their base in Kuwait. The soldiers were clearing ammunition remaining from a July 11th explosion when some of it detonated. The Pentagon said today it has discovered cracks in its top fighter jet. Pentagon spokesman Pete Williams confirmed a report in Jane's Defense Weekly saying the F-16 had developed stress fractures. Jane's reported the cracks had been found in 2,900 F-16s worldwide. The Pentagon also announced it intends to sell 80 newer F-16s to Turkey, which had been a key U.S. ally in the Gulf War. Jim?
Israeli Prime Minister Shamir said today he hoped for peace talks within 2 months. It was said in a statement released by his office. He said some problems remain, but, quote, I think we are approaching the start of negotiations, end quote. Britain's central bank was told more than 3 years ago terrorists kept accounts at the seized Bank of Credit and Commerce International. A top central bank official made the disclosure today. He said Scotland Yard was brought in to investigate. One of the terrorists was Palestinian Abu Nidal, according to British news reports.
There was more fighting in Yugoslavia today. 2 people were killed in clashes between Croats and Serbs in Croatia. Leaders of the republics of Serbia and Croatia accused each other of pushing the country to the brink of civil war. The accusations came a day after the collapse of a Yugoslav leaders' peace summit and one of the bloodiest ethnic battles in years. We have a report narrated by Louise Bates of Worldwide Television News.
It was the worst single day of violence in Croatia since the civil war of the early 1940s. In Mirkovic, near Vinkovci, 21 people were killed by machine gun fire and mortar attacks. The afternoon saw hand-to-hand fighting between the rival Serb and Croatian militias. The killings brought the official death toll in just a few weeks to 129. Clashes continued Tuesday as Croatia maintained its claim for independence. More evidence of fighting in Croatia. These government planes were filled with bullet holes after being fired on by opposition forces. Violence like this led to the breakdown of peace talks in Macedonia. Speaking after the failed meeting, an exasperated Stipe Mesic, the Croatian chairman of Yugoslavia's collective presidency, told the press his nation had reached the end. He said Yugoslavia would have to solve its problems quickly or all its citizens face destruction.
A radical Soviet newspaper today published what it said was Mikhail Gorbachev's new platform for the Communist Party. The draft statement rejects Marxist principles, respects religious freedom, and supports private property. The Communist Party Central Committee meets in 2 days. It's expected to debate the controversial platform, although one committee member said the draft published today is certain to undergo some editing before then. The International Monetary Fund announced today that Mikhail Gorbachev had asked for full Soviet membership in the organization. Western leaders last week proposed a new associate status for the Soviet Union that would provide technical assistance but no access to loans. The Bush administration has opposed full Soviet membership.
In this country, a doctors group today called for a ban on television food ads aimed at children. A statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics said the ads exploit children and promote poor eating habits. A spokesman for the grocery manufacturers called the recommendation overkill. The countdown has begun for tomorrow's launch of the Space Shuttle Atlantis. During their 9-day flight, astronauts will release a communications satellite to link spacecraft with ground controls. The launch is scheduled for 10:55 a.m. Eastern Time.
Police in Milwaukee today arrested a man in connection with a grisly mass murder. Officers said they found body parts of up to 15 people in the man's apartment, including 3 human heads stored in a refrigerator. They also found a dresser drawer filled with photographs of mutilated bodies and a barrel of acid. Police went to the building after receiving a report from another man who said he'd been handcuffed and threatened with a knife in the apartment.
And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to AIDS testing of doctors, the post-Cold War CIA, and making hay in the Kansas sunshine. Our lead story tonight is a medical story, the toughest one around right now, how to deal with doctors and other healthcare workers with AIDS. Just today, Northwestern University in Chicago advised 125 people to be tested for AIDS because a student dentist who treated them has the AIDS virus. Our coverage begins with this backgrounder by Kwame Holman.
It happened to Kimberly Bergalis, and suddenly almost everyone felt at risk. Last summer, federal authorities documented that the 22-year-old Florida resident was the first person in the United States to contract AIDS during dental treatment. The Centers for Disease Control kept her identity secret, but she chose a public stand.
If this can be prevented from happening to another family, then that needs to be done.
Bergalis, who said she had no other risk factors for AIDS, had had 2 teeth extracted in 1987. Health officials at first dismissed her claim that her dentist, Dr. David Acker, then rumored to be dying of AIDS, may have infected her. But a new laboratory technique called DNA sequencing showed that the strains of virus infecting both doctor and patient were almost identical, meaning the 2 cases were somehow linked. Then in January, the CDC reported 2 more cases of HIV infection linked to Dr. Acker. Barbara Webb was treated for a toothache on the same day Kimberly Bergalis had molars pulled. And Richard Driscoll, who on one visit in 1989 had his teeth cleaned the same day as Barbara Webb. Webb says the dentist, diagnosed in 1987, never told his patients he had AIDS.
If I were forced to talk to him, I think I would ask him why he did something so terrible to 3 people and potentially more, how he could find it in his conscience to treat people when he had AIDS and he knew it.
No one knows exactly how Acker's patients became infected. 2 days before his death, the dentist published an emotional statement claiming he had, quote, strictly adhered to the CDC's infection control guidelines. And as for telling his patients, well, for years the CDC has maintained that the risk to patients from HIV-infected healthcare workers is so small, actually hundreds of times smaller than the risk to healthcare workers from infected patients, that disclosure is unnecessary. But with the emergence of the Florida cases and mounting public fear bordering on panic, the agency felt new pressure to change its stance. As the CDC grappled with that issue, stories of doctors and dentists with AIDS made headlines. The state of Delaware offered free AIDS tests to patients of a dentist who had died 2 weeks earlier. An Ohio hospital dusted off the patient files of a surgeon whose death from AIDS was reported in 1988. And back in Florida, an orthodontist with AIDS closed up shop and advised his patients to be tested. Apart from the patients in Florida, the science so far, based on 3 published studies, shows no cases of a doctor transmitting AIDS to patients. But many say that's not enough proof to conclude that the risk is minute. Jonathan Shukor specializes in personal injury and medical malpractice litigation.
We simply don't know who the other physicians and surgeons are, so how do we look at who their patients are? How do we know how many AIDS-infected, HIV-positive patients there are in this country who contracted the disease in an operating room or a procedure room?
Shukor and many others say healthcare providers who perform invasive procedures should be tested regularly and required to inform their patients if they become infected with AIDS.
There ought to be no physician that subjects you or any listener to the threat of AIDS without disclosing that threat before any invasive procedure is done. Because there's no reason for any of us to get this disease because a physician or surgeon doesn't feel it necessary to tell us about it.
In 1983, as a cardiologist at Johns Hopkins Hospital, Dr. Hasib Aoun contracted AIDS from a patient. His highly promising career was finished.
And there are many more risks to patients at hospitals, much more significant than AIDS. I'll give you an example. Cardiac catheterization. Well, cardiac catheterization is an important diagnostic procedure. Some patients die from it, but we don't just cancel out the procedure because it's useful. Well, similarly, all these HIV-infected professionals, they're still very useful for society and for themselves, for their own families. And removing them from the practice of medicine, from patient contact, is almost criminal. And it establishes a vicious cycle that will never stop. You feed into the fears of the public instead of educating the public.
But such fears only got worse when 2 more of the Florida dentist's patients were diagnosed with AIDS, bringing the total to 5. The revelations increased the pressure on the Centers for Disease Control, which was trying to come up with AIDS guidelines for health workers. Last week, when the long-awaited rules were announced, the CDC recommended merely that doctors who perform certain invasive procedures get tested regularly for AIDS. It also recommended that health workers who are HIV positive must get their patients' permission before performing those invasive procedures.
We are not a regulatory body. We're in the business of providing advice, and what we anticipate happening is very quickly these recommendations will be viewed as the standard for medical and dental practice around the country, and people will be held to account first by their own professional ethics, but soon by professional bodies like the American Medical Association, the American Dental Association, and their state counterparts.
But some in Congress aren't content to let the healthcare profession police itself when it comes to AIDS. Last week, the Senate considered a measure offered by Republican Jesse Helms of North Carolina. It calls for a 10-year prison term and a $10,000 fine for AIDS-infected healthcare workers who perform invasive procedures without first informing their patients. But the provision to jail and fine HIV-infected health workers who operate without their patients' consent passed the Senate overwhelmingly. so did a measure that would force states to make the CDC guidelines mandatory for health workers. All the issues will be considered by the House in September.
The CDC and Senate actions have started an equally passionate debate among medical professionals, and we sample that now. Dr. James Todd is the Executive Vice President of the American Medical Association. Dr. Stanford Kuven is a specialist in infectious diseases. As a researcher at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, he discovered an antibody test for malaria in 1962. Dr. John Wolfe is a practicing dentist in New York City. Of his 1,800 patients, some 60% have tested positive for the AIDS virus. Gentlemen, let's take each of these developments separately, quickly, just to get your views on them. And first of all, the Helms Amendment, providing criminal penalties. Dr. Wolfe, what's your reaction to the Helms Amendment?
Well, I think that the Helms Amendment is typically draconian, typical of Senator Helms. I think that before we need jails and prison terms, I think we need a lot of dialogue. I think we need a lot of sanity. I think we need to try to grapple with public fear and public hysteria and look at the facts and the science. This disease has been around for 10 years, and we have a great deal of information on HIV, and there is more information to be had. But I think that a criminal penalty for not disclosing HIV status is going to backlash. It's not going to serve the public interest, actually.
Dr. Kuven, what do you think of the Helms Amendment?
I think the Helms Amendment is inappropriate. It's too punitive. The most outrageous thing is that medicine has opted out of leadership, as has public health leadership, in essence forcing the Congress to do it. And the Congress has no business legislating health. This has always been a federalist system in our country, but it's been because of the weakness of organized medicine in every aspect of being reactive instead of proactive, whether it's at the AMA level or the American Dental Association level or at the public health policy level of the CDC. We've been dealing with a political civil rights issue instead of a public health issue.
Dr. Todd, you're organized medicine in one of those organizations. Maybe you'd like to answer that. And also, what do you think of the Helms Amendment?
Well, certainly there's been no vacuum of leadership among the American medical profession. And we have to remember 4 important things as we talk about AIDS. First of all, with the exception of the dentist, there is absolutely no evidence of transmission from a healthcare worker to a patient. Secondly, in January of this year, the American Medical Association, the American Dental Association published guidelines to guide our members and the professionals of this country, which were validated by the CDC in July of this year because their guidelines are essentially the same. When it comes to testing, if we thought testing, either of doctors or patients, would end this epidemic, we would do it tomorrow, but we know it won't. There's a window between the time a person is infected by the virus and the time that they become positive. So how often do you test? Once a week? Once a month? Every 6 months? It doesn't give you any security. And worst of all, it drives people away from being tested and knowing what their serum status is. What we're saying is that there are certain procedures where there is an identifiable risk of transmission, perhaps, it's not been proven, but perhaps, under those circumstances, a physician should know their serum status, and if they are positive, they should stop doing procedures or inform the patient. Not necessarily inform the patient in all instances, because there are many things that an HIV-positive physician can do that poses absolutely no threat to a patient.
Okay, so that is essentially the CDC position, the CDC guidelines position, is it not? What do you think, Dr. Wolfe, of the CDC's rules?
I think that they're excellent, and I think that...
In other words, get tested regularly if you do invasive procedures, and if you test positive, you must tell the patient and get his permission or her permission before you do it.
For invasive procedures, I do believe that the CDC's guidelines also include a panel of including, they recommended a state health department person, a specialist in infectious disease, a practitioner who is of the same profession as the healthcare worker who tested positive to review the procedures that that healthcare worker is performing and to make recommendations for modification of those procedures, so that that all being done on a confidential level would not mandate the healthcare worker exposing or disclosing his HIV status to every single patient. The dentist also, or physician or podiatrist or whoever, also has the option of not doing those procedures and referring them out or modifying them according to what the experts feel would be safe for the public. I think this would be the safest and the most sane approach to protect the public.
All right.
And Robin, there's one other point that
Dr.
we
Todd.
can't ignore at this point, and that's universal precautions. All of the experts in this disease maintain that universal precautions are still the best protection against transmission of the disease.
Just spell those out very briefly, what you mean by that term.
Well, it means wearing gloves of protective nature, wearing waterproof, blood-proof gowns, wearing goggles and masks so that fluids from patients are not transmitted to the physician, and that fluids from the physician cannot be transmitted to the patient.
But it also means being very careful with, in the case of dentists, particularly with instruments,
Yes.
is it not? There was a claim or an allegation that one of the dentists in question had used the same saliva extractor without having sterilized it on more than one patient. And the AIDS virus can be communicated by, transmitted by the saliva, can it?
It can be. It can. It's more likely to be transmitted blood to blood. But the point is, it can be transmitted from patient to patient if the operatory is not disinfected properly and if the instruments aren't sterilized properly. Absolutely.
So, in other words, instrument sterilization and care is part of the universal precautions.
Yes, it is.
Now, what do you think of the CDC guidelines, Dr. Kubin?
Robin, the CDC guidelines are certainly a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, they don't go far enough. Firstly, they don't go far enough in the sense that they don't call for mandatory testing. Every patient has an absolute right to know what harm can befall he or she from a healthcare worker who's a carrier of HIV or hepatitis B. And conversely, every healthcare worker has exactly that same right. Blood is truly a two-way street, and each must know about the other.
It doesn't mandate mandatory testing for whom?
For either. And the fact is, the second omission, in addition to mandatory testing from the guidelines, is that of testing the patients. The patients are not even mentioned in the guideline, and blood is a two-way street.
So you think every doctor, every healthcare worker should be tested?
No, only those carrying out invasive procedures.
And every patient
undergoing invasive procedures.
Should be
but
tested.
The key thing that I think Dr. Todd has not mentioned is that voluntarism, which the AMA has called for only as late as January. Before that, not so. But because 2 cases came on board in January, there was a call for voluntary testing. Voluntarism has failed in Florida, as evidenced by the Florida paradigm, the Florida example. It's failed by the almost weekly exposures of physicians not coming forward voluntarily and revealing, or dentists revealing their status. It's failed because the CDC's own estimates of risk, which were mathematical modules prepared by the CDC, indicated that up to 128 patients got AIDS from their healthcare workers. But most of all, it's failed by the fact that we have 6,000 healthcare workers with AIDS, about 40,000 with HIV, thousands more with hepatitis B. I would put it to you, will any one of them stand up and come forward voluntarily and reveal their status to either their patients or their peers? I think not. And the fact is that we already have mandatory testing with our military, with our blood supply, with our Job Corps, with our overseas State Department employees, with our prisoners, with our immigrants, and with your life insurance policy. So if it's good enough for a big chunk of our segment already, surely then mandatory testing is only a test. It's like getting any other blood test.
Well, let's go to
No,
Dr.
that's
Todd.
not quite.
What's your reaction, Dr. Todd?
Getting an AIDS test is not like getting any other blood test. Absolutely not. The voluntary disclosure has not failed. It's not been given a chance to work. We have physicians across this country that have come forward and said that they are HIV positive. And every time that has happened, they have been ostracized from the profession and have been destroyed. We want to make sure that we know what we mean by invasive procedures. We want to be able to tell physicians when they should know what their positivity is, but universal testing, at what frequency, what security?
I'll be happy to address that if you allow me to.
Well, at what frequency and how do you make it mandatory?
Very simply. The fact is that if you link it to licensure and test once a year, it costs about $40 for a blood test, it costs about $100,000 to treat an AIDS patient. Our airline pilots are tested once a year and on demand for drugs. Our physicians who carry out only invasive procedures should be tested once a year and on demand. You will not eliminate 100%, but you sure will eliminate well over 90% by doing that very simplistic measure. It's common sense, it's realistic, it's part of the Dannemeyer-Kimberly-Bragalis Act that's before the House subcommittee chaired by Congressman Waxman. It's simplicity itself, and I fail to go to bed at night and wake up in the morning and understand why this is not being done.
Let's come to Dr. Wolf on that.
Sure. I think that people are interested in a quick fix, and I'm clearly interested in what's good for the public safety. I think that this is a deceiving kind of quick fix. There is a window period, as Dr. Todd has mentioned. There are approximately 10 to 20% of full-blown AIDS patients who continue to test HIV negative. The window period can be between 3 months from the time of exposure to the time of testing, to the time of actually testing positive, to 2 years. And there are some that are longer.
Just to stop you there for a moment. So to do it once a year or even on demand, you're saying you might miss a lot of people who have the HIV infection.
That's
and
right.
Would be in a position with that infection to be potentially infecting somebody else, a patient.
That's right. But if you were HIV positive, and if you were performing invasive procedures, or if you were infected with HIV, and you missed the testing, or your infection was missed by testing, and you still use universal precautions, I believe that the risk is still very, very low. When Dr. Kuvan said 128 patients, these are computer patients. These are non-existent patients. These are made-up patients. There are not 128 patients that have become positive as a result of HIV practitioners infecting them. In fact, even the Kimberly Bragalis case in Florida, as unfortunate as it may be, could very, very easily, in fact, very likely have been infection from dirty instruments, and that's been published in the Times as well.
Let me ask you this. We have to move on. I just want to ask you this. Apart from the danger of maybe missing some HIV-infected healthcare workers with regular testing, what is the harm in mandatory testing?
Well, I think that there is a great deal of harm, and one is that it is a false sense of security, in that if you were to go to a dentist on Long Island or in Iowa who you knew was HIV negative, and he had a fairly large practice of HIV negative patients, and he would feel some kind of sense of security in maybe not wearing gloves or not sterilizing an instrument properly or not disinfecting a room, which happens all the time when you're very busy. It's very easy to bring a patient right into the room after having been alcoholed, which is inadequate, clearly. Then the patient is at risk, even though they think they're not at risk because the practitioner is HIV negative. I think that it's clear, since there are no known cases of HIV transmission from infected practitioner to patient, though there may be some risk, this is not the panacea. This is not going to quell public panic.
Two brief comments, if I may, Robin. Firstly, the Florida paradigm warns that you don't wait for a second 47 to crash if you know what was wrong with the first one. Secondly, when it comes to HIV, it's a secret disease that's not reported in 22 states where 76% of the cases come from. If you can't test for it, you can't trace it. If you can't trace it, you can't treat it. And if you can't treat it, you can't prolong life. So this is the first time in the history of public health that a lethal communicable disease is non-reportable. It's unheard of. And that's the message that has to go out to America. The other point is that with regard to universal precautions that Dr. Todd so eloquently stated, universal precautions do not provide for universal safety. Physicians and surgeons still stick themselves, they cut their gloves, up to 30% of gloves leak. The cognitive resources of physicians and surgeons are often amiss. They make mistakes, both motor and mental skills are sometimes missing. properly. In other words, universal precautions don't provide universal safety, and they cover up a disease which is being treated as a secret disease.
Dr. Todd, what is your objection, the AMA's objection, to mandatory testing?
Well, I think Dr. Wolf has expressed it very well. It does not give you the sense of security that is necessary. We've never had a disease like this before.
Apart from misleading you, if that argument is correct, about a sense of security, what harm does mandatory testing do to the health delivery profession?
I think that it does two pieces of harm. First of all, if mandatory testing comes along, it'll be a very short space of time before mandatory disclosure comes along, and then every physician who is found to be HIV positive will suddenly find themselves unable to practice their profession. The second thing is...
Even if they're not involved in invasive procedures?
Even if they're not involved in invasive procedures. Every physician who has come forward with HIV positivity has literally been drummed out of the profession by their colleagues and by their patients. The second harm is that if physicians find they can avoid testing by avoiding invasive procedures, we will begin to see physicians who choose not to treat potential HIV positive patients, choose not to treat patients with invasive procedures who need the treatment done and may have an adverse effect on access to health care.
I'm sorry to stop it there. We could obviously go on and on, but that is our time for this evening, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to this. Thank you all three.
Thank you.
Jim?
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, the new CIA and making hay in the Kansas sunshine. Now a major examination of what the CIA and the American intelligence community of tomorrow should look and be like. The confirmation hearings of Robert Gates to be Director of Central Intelligence have been put on hold until September because of questions about the Iran-Contra affair. But whoever becomes the new director, the main job will be to grapple with the profound changes brought about by the end of the Cold War. Time Magazine's national security correspondent Bruce Van Voorst has our report.
I'm a much nicer person now. Well, I'm glad to hear it.
It's a scenario that baby boomers grew up with. The sinister KGB agent, the daring, dashing intelligence officer, Cold War capers, James Bond thrillers, much intrigue, and romance. The only drawback was the possibility of a nuclear disaster lurking around the corner. The real world is much different. Every day, several thousand U.S. government employees troop to work in this modest cement and glass 7-story building just outside Washington, D.C. It could be a branch office for IBM or Procter & Gamble. It is, in fact, the headquarters for the Director of Central Intelligence, America's chief spy. There's neither cloak nor dagger at CIA. In the entrance, there's a statue of the father of CIA, William Donovan, a profile of long-serving director, Allen Dulles, and chiseled on the wall the biblical quote he saw as justification for spying, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Few outsiders have gotten this far, let alone going through the key punch turnstile as we did one recent Sunday afternoon, walking down the marble hall of honor past the portraits of former directors, including the 9th, George Herbert Walker Bush, and up 2 flights into the top-secret Network Management Center. This is the agency's data processing center. Every message to and from the agency's worldwide network goes through this maze of computers, including a Cray supercomputer capable of executing 1 billion calculations a second, with millions of messages and reports at the fingertips of agency analysts. While the CIA's technology may be state-of-the-art, its original mission has become outmoded. For more than 40 years, the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union guaranteed a vital role for intelligence gathering and left unchallenged its $30 billion price tag. After years of concentrating on the Soviet threat, the intelligence community gets mixed reviews on its performance. It seriously misread Soviet economic trends, says an outspoken critic, Senator Patrick Moynihan, a longtime member of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
This is the central fact, that for 35 years, the Central Intelligence Agency, and you love those guys, but they collected everything there was to know about the Soviet Union, excepting the fact that it was falling apart. Our presidents were systematically told the Soviet Union was a maturing industrial society that had the capacity to maintain the size of the military, which it did have, and we were accurate about that. But we were wrong about the fact that it couldn't maintain it. And secondly, that it could carry on international adventures indefinitely, which also it couldn't do. Had our presidents known, our policy could not have been what it was.
Richard Helms, director of the CIA during the Nixon presidency, takes exception to Senator Moynihan.
Let's take a look at the Cold War. Who won it? The West. And what did we know? We knew practically everything about what was going on in the Soviet Union.
Except the budget.
This is the thing that is argued about. Senator Moynihan has raised this point. The best economists in the United States and the free world were all used to work on that Soviet budget. Some of the time we had it quite right, some of the time we had it quite wrong. Nobody had it right all the time, and that includes Senator Moynihan.
Whether the agency got it right or not, the target was clear-cut: the Soviet Union, along with its satellite countries in Eastern Europe. But with the unraveling of socialism in one country after another, and the Kremlin in turmoil, there are new targets. Other world hotspots demand attention and require different kinds of spies. The CIA is at a critical juncture, and the question is whether it is up to the new challenges. James Schlesinger has held many government portfolios, including a stint as Director of Central Intelligence.
The world is quite different, not only in terms of foreign policy, but in terms of intelligence. The Cold War was a period of great simplification. Not only did you know basically how the world was divided between the Soviet Union and the United States and their allies, but that in the world of intelligence, all that one was really looking for was the accoutrements of this grand confrontation. Now we are moving into a world which is much more complex, which is much more subtle.
Congressman David McCurdy, who chairs the House Intelligence Committee, says the new complexities will require new skills.
It's easier during the Cold War to focus your primary resources on the Soviet Union and to build large systems and use technology to try to get all this data about the Soviets. But it's another thing to have people that are that understand the region, understand the economics, the politics, the culture, in order to report back trends and developments.
Such experts will be vital to help prevent, or at least anticipate, volatile regional conflicts. Admiral Bobby Inman is a former Deputy Director of Central Intelligence.
Now what you worry about is somebody going to fire a ballistic missile across borders to hit a country 300 miles away, 400 miles away with a weapon of mass destruction. How do you alert them before it happens that may occur bolt out of the blue? And how do you plan to try to deal with that kind of problem? It's a whole new challenge that we've never dealt with in these last 45 years, but it's a real challenge for the late 90s.
The U.S. didn't have to wait until the late 90s for its first major post-Cold War confrontation. The Persian Gulf War in many ways exemplified the challenges U.S. intelligence faces in the new era. In what many observers consider a major failure, the intelligence community did not predict Saddam Hussein's plans to invade Kuwait.
I think we did not anticipate, we did not have good intelligence of the intentions of a Saddam Hussein. And I think that's a fundamental weakness throughout the community, is understanding intentions as opposed to the capabilities of a military or an adversary.
Senator David Boren, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, believes this failure may have had tragic consequences.
The war might have been avoided if the President of the United States had been told 6 months earlier, this man is perhaps thinking about invading his neighbor, or he's a real threat to his neighbor. He might have then gone to our president might have gone to the king of Saudi Arabia and said, let's think about putting a base here to deter him from this aggression. So a whole range of options were foreclosed to us and to our president because he didn't know in time.
Some observers claim that after Iraq invaded Kuwait, intelligence on the military picture improved.
Once they got underway, the ultimate performance was superlative. But we're lucky that we had 6 months to get ready. I'm persuaded from a close examination that the intelligence performance, once we began the war, substantially shortened the war and very significantly reduced U.S. casualties.
But the commander of Operation Desert Storm, General Norman Schwarzkopf, was not nearly as generous. In testimony before Congress last month, the general relayed bitter complaints from his field commanders about the lack of tactical battlefield information.
One of the shortcomings we found is that we just don't have an immediately responsive intelligence capability that will give the theater commander near real-time information that he personally needs to make a decision. I think that the intelligence community should be asked to come up with a system that will, in fact, be capable of delivering a real-time product to a theater commander when he requests that. It could be aircraft, it could be other capabilities, and I leave that to the experts to come up with.
General William Odom, former head of Army Intelligence and director of the National Security Agency, says the delay in getting tactical information quickly to the field is more a problem of management than a lack of technology.
We've built up this wonderful technology capability, but we have a lot of residual organizational resistance turning around and dealing with these kinds of requirements.
In other words, we can collect the information, but we can't process it properly.
Absolutely. Well, we can process it properly. What we can't do is get the collection systems to respond to the fellow out there on the ground who wants it down at a low tactical level and get it back to him in the form he wants it very rapidly. There's no technical reason for not being able to do that. The only reason for not being able to do that is institutional rigidity.
General Schwarzkopf also said intelligence community analysts hedged too much during the war.
Although the fundamental intelligence facts that we had were helpful, that the analysis that we received was unhelpful. And it was unhelpful because it ended up being so caveated. There were so many disagreements within the intelligence community themselves. There were so many disclaimers that by the time you got done reading many of the intelligence estimates you received, no matter what happened, they would have been right. I mean, and that's not helpful to the guy in the field.
The White House was quick to counter Schwarzkopf. In a briefing the next day, Press Secretary Marlin Fitzwater said, "What the president has said before and still believes is that our overall intelligence was excellent." To other observers, the Schwarzkopf criticism is all too familiar. Senator William Cohen has just completed 8 years' service as a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, 4 of them as co-chairman.
Well, we have a proliferation of agencies. We have so many of the services now that have their own intelligence functions that they are either redundant, overlapping, and certainly not sharing that information.
Too many agencies, too many disclaimers, and maybe not enough good old-fashioned spies. Some experts say American intelligence suffers from an unrequited love affair with high-tech intelligence gathering. Overhead satellite photography and electronic eavesdropping, what's called in the trade national technical means. A satellite dish on the CIA grounds makes the point. Nearby is a statue of the Revolutionary War hero Nathan Hale, who was executed by the British for spying. The professionals say American intelligence needs more Nathan Hales.
I think that there has been a tendency to use the national technical means as a crutch. It was less damaging in some ways when we had the international confrontation. And the reason for that is that one can count the number of silo holes in the Soviet Union. One can see how far they are proceeding with their ABM defenses without understanding their motivations.
We have to do far better than we've done in the immediate past with our human assets and our human activities, because when you have Eastern Europe and Soviet Union in flux, where you have the Middle East in flux, you don't sense the mood of a bazaar from a satellite 100 miles in space. To do that, you need human beings.
George Carver is retired after a career at the senior levels in the CIA, including many years in the clandestine services, the department that recruits spies.
You can't whistle up Farsi speakers overnight. You can't whistle up people who speak fluent Iraqi-type Arabic who can blend into the scenery at Baghdad on the 2nd of August, 1990. If you want them, you better have thought of that the 2nd of August, 1980.
But even spies have their limitations. Former director Richard Helms says they're only human.
I just like to point out that when newspaper men get smart and say, we ought to know about Saddam Hussein's intentions and so forth, they sit right here in Washington with all kinds of connections, yet they don't know what President Bush is going to do about a certain appointment or about a certain move. So why should the intelligence community be able to read into the mind of somebody like Saddam Hussein? Maybe they're going to have a good connection. They're going to try, but it's not guaranteed. And after all, I'd like to point out that God did not give man the gift of prescience, and that includes intelligence officers.
For years, intelligence officers have been trying to read the minds of heads of state. The next subjects may be heads of foreign industry. The U.S. already collects economic and financial data on a broad scale. The question now is how far should the U.S. go to acquire corporate business and high technology secrets?
There's a whole new area going to open up here, which is economic competition among the Japanese, the European community, and the United States. And then if we're going to be competitive, we've got to be able to protect our own trade secrets, our own development secrets, our own R&D, so that we have a chance of being competitive. If these fellows are going to be permitted to steal us blind, we're going to be at a distinct disadvantage. There's a big counterintelligence problem to be run here.
But by tradition, Americans are reluctant to have government involved in private enterprise.
For the U.S. government to get into the business of technological intelligence raises all kinds of questions because of the laws under which we operate. Laws quite different from those of our competitors. I mean, neither Mr. Sherman nor Mr. Clayton was Japanese. And if you acquire technological intelligence, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to give it to General Electric as opposed to General Motors? Are you going to publish it in the Wall Street Journal?
Collecting business intelligence, recruiting third world spies, these and other new challenges will face whoever becomes the new director of the CIA. The director of Central Intelligence wears two hats. Wearing one, he runs the Central Intelligence Agency. With the other, he nominally presides over the rest of a sprawling intelligence bureaucracy. And most of that is dominated by the Department of Defense. Taken together, collecting intelligence costs the federal government $30 billion a year. With a government-wide budget squeeze, the intelligence community is facing pressure to slim down.
Downsize? What does any big $30 billion enterprise do when it turned out to produce one Edsel after another Edsel after another Edsel? Downsize. Don't look for new, silly, quasi-Cold War efforts like, find the narco-terrorists or steal the economic secrets of Albania.
But they're offering that to us right now as new challenges.
That's a normal institutional thing to do. It's called institutional maintenance in social science. It's not unusual, but they ought to fight it.
Few other insiders are willing to see such budget cutting.
You're still going to have a defense budget that's on the order of $300 billion a year. I would assert that spending 10% of that to understand what's happening in the outside world is not an unreasonable target for the U.S. to undertake.
As it turns out, only a small percentage of the intelligence budget goes to the CIA. 90% of it goes to the parts of the intelligence community controlled by the Pentagon and the Secretary of Defense. That plunges the Central Intelligence Director right into a classic Washington power struggle.
I would like to point out that the big gorilla on the field in Washington is the Secretary of Defense. All these other organizations work for the Secretary of Defense. They're paid by him, and their fitness reports are made out by him. Therefore, he has a great deal of power over what they do. So it is very hard, unless he's willing to cooperate in this endeavor, to put anybody over him that's going to have any power to change anything in the intelligence community.
Senator Boren warns that cooperation between military and civilian intelligence networks will be essential in the next decade.
In the world 10 years from now, as we look into the next century, the United States is going to have fewer and fewer troops positioned all around the world. This means you're going to have early warning. You're going to have to be able to move very quickly into a hot spot where you don't have troops on the ground. And your civilian intelligence and your military people are going to have to be able to work together very, very closely. The civilian intelligence community is going to have to be able to tell our military commanders in short order the kind of information they need to operate. So you can't have two separate worlds, one military intelligence and one civilian. You're going to have to bring them together in a much closer working relationship than we've had in the past.
The new Director of Central Intelligence has a third task almost as important as managing the bureaucracy and its budget. It is maintaining the intelligence community's integrity. During the Cold War, intelligence officers often operated on the fringes of law and morality in the name of national security. Scandals and congressional investigations were almost routine. The Iran-Contra probe is a continuing example. Morton Halperin was a former National Security Council staffer in the Nixon administration. He now runs the Washington office of the American Civil Liberties Union.
You never can preclude abuses by intelligence agencies, and therefore that is a risk that you run if you decide you have intelligence agencies. I think there is very real tension between a clandestine intelligence agency and a free society. I think we accepted it for the first time in the Cold War period, and I think in light of the end of the Cold War, we need to assess a variety of things at home, including secret intelligence agencies, and make sure that we end the Cold War at home as we end it abroad.
We've just been lucky in the United States. We've got vast oceans on both sides that have been protecting us all these years, so we've been, up until comparatively recently, able to say, oh, well, we don't need all that stuff. We can have everything out in the open and so on. But let me just point out that when the intercontinental ballistic missile came into being, and there are lots of them in the Soviet Union, and they're still aimed at the United States, this changes our vulnerability, and we certainly need a good intelligence apparatus.
Engraved on the wall of the CIA lobby are 53 stars, one for each of the agency's heroes who died in this nation's secret wars. It is the nature of the business that even now, in some cases many years later, not all the names are public. And so it is with an intelligence community in a democratic society. The public will never have all the secrets. But as the Cold War fades, the confirmation hearings for Robert Gates as Director of Central Intelligence offer an opportunity to review the tasks and performances of America's secret intelligence organizations.
Finally tonight, some thoughts on the season from the plains of Kansas. Our essayist is Jim Fisher of the Kansas City Times.
The late winter calves born amidst cold rains now cluster in the sun, looking more like their mamas every day. The April foals, deer-like and wobbly just 60 days ago, are shedding their coats, measuring their world with their gangly legs. The corn planted just weeks ago is already shoulder high, dwarfing the just sown soybeans. Now come the July afternoons, skies blue and cloudless, with rising temperatures. How hot today? 95, 100? And the south winds, bending grass all but untrammeled for a year, now ready for an annual passage. It's haying time. All over the northern hemisphere, the hay is coming in. Crews in 1 week, gone the next, the land swept bare. Now it's time for old tractors to chug around fields, pulling the mower conditioners. The sickle bar and hay rake are mostly gone. Time for the newly cut hay to bake in the July heat. Then for the ungainly round balers, disgorging what look like giant portions of shredded wheat. And finally, when more hay is turned and dry, for the square baler to spit it out, bale after bale. Then the real work, the lifting and resting and pitching. Bucking hay, they call it, an appropriate description.
That's a heavy one.
These are days of stinging sweat and sore backs, calloused hands and water jugs. A young man's labor, one of laughter and talk and shared hard work.
These are spread out further. You can go a little bit faster, Tom.
Almost an anomaly in this era of unbridled individuality. Of smelling the new mown hay, an aroma that will linger in some men's memories long after they have left the fields for the last time, gone on to careers that are far from broken bales, tilting loads and hay hooks. It's hot, dusty, dirty work. One dreaded yet somehow satisfying once the bales start to bounce out of the baler. There's a curious freedom in a hayfield. No phone, no meetings, no pressures. Just picking up one bale after another. If man has a behavior akin to squirrels storing nuts, haying is surely it. Even with the complicated square and round balers, devices great-granddad would have shaken his head at, haying is a remnant of all our past, when harvest, not the local supermarket, was essential to our lives. Remember the old snapshots when whole families went into the fields to cut and stack, bundle and thrash, pick and shuck? When people worked together, got to know their neighbors even better, ate field hand meals that would become a family legend. Now, what we see in the hayfield today, men and boys, is a mere shadow of times past. But at least that shadow remains. While ever newer machines have all but automated the harvest of a lot of crops, hay remains essentially the same. Labor-intensive, awkward, repetitious, seemingly endless. Its tools are simple, gloves and maybe a hay hook, nothing high-tech. Load after load, on the truck, tied down, into the barn, safe from weather and rot, and worth it. As sure as the billowing dust behind a loaded pickup, the cold winds of December will come, and livestock will get hungry. And in the barn, why, all that hay, waiting, still mildly fragrant, still showing the green of a long-ago July. Just hay, but there's a promise of something else, another summer. I'm Jim Fisher.
Again, the major stories of this Tuesday. President Bush told reporters he was considering proposals that would loosen economic sanctions against Iraq in order to lessen the harm to innocent children and other Iraqi citizens. And Israeli Prime Minister Shamir said he hoped Mideast peace talks would begin within 2 months. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Jim. That's the News Hour for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night with a look at what may be the Communist Party's last hurrah in Moscow. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.
Funding for the News Hour has been provided by PepsiCo. Every day we enjoy people being cold to us, cutting us up, getting fresh with us, tearing into us, and calling us chicken. In fact, the more people do it, the happier we are. PepsiCo. And by AT&T. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And by the financial support of viewers like you. Video cassettes of the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1.
This is PBS.